The Luftwaffe razed Moscow for 30 days. Stalin unleashed 5,000 IL-2s and incinerated Berlin in revenge July 22, 1941. Exactly 1 month after the largest invasion force in history crossed the Soviet borders, the sound of the apocalypse came to Moscow. It was not the rumble of tanks or the crackle of rifles, but a deep, ominous drone in the night sky, a sound that grew, that multiplied, until it became the roar of hundreds of engines. Operation Barbarossa had reached the capital. On the city's rooftops, thousands of volunteer lookouts, mostly women and teenagers, looked up. They watched as searchlight beams sliced through the darkness, desperately hunting for the invisible predators. And then they found them, cross-shaped silhouettes, elegant and deadly, caught for an instant in the white light. They were the Heinkel Ha-111 bombers of the Luftwaffe. The first bomb fell near the Kremlin. The explosion shook the city's foundations, an artificial thunder that silenced the beating of millions of hearts. Then more fell. High-explosive bombs that tore craters in the avenues, and thousands of small incendiary bombs that rained down like the devil's seeds, sprouting into flowers of fire on the wooden rooftops. The initial panic was a freezing wave. People ran through the streets, a human torrent seeking shelter from the death falling from the sky. The air raid sirens wailed, a cacophony of terror that mingled with the whistle of bombs and the roar of explosions. Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Empire, the untouchable sanctuary of communism, was burning. But panic gave way to a grim determination. The city was not paralyzed, it organized. The rooftop lookouts, armed with simple shovels and buckets of sand, became the first line of defense. When a magnesium incendiary bomb fell, they would rush to smother it before the fire could spread, a desperate fight against a shower of embers. Underground, a parallel world came to life. The Moscow metro stations, built deep underground like subterranean palaces of marble and mosaics, were transformed into the largest and safest air raid shelters in the world. Tens of thousands huddled on the platforms, listening to the dull thud of distant bombs, while the trains continued to run, transporting troops and supplies. For 30 nights, the Luftwaffe returned. Night after night, Hermann Göring's bombers tried to break the city's will, to reduce it to ashes, to decapitate the Soviet leadership, and sow chaos that would allow Army Group Center to deliver the final blow. They believed they were striking at the heart of a giant with feet of clay. They did not know that every bomb that fell not only destroyed buildings, but forged a will of iron. They did not know that in the Kremlin, a man with eyes of steel watched the fires and saw not the end, but the beginning of a long and terrible reckoning. The humiliation of seeing his capital under attack was planting the seed of a vengeance on a scale that not even they, the masters of the lightning war, could conceive. Moscow was burning, yes, but in its flames, the steel of retribution was being tempered. In the opulent halls of Karen Hall, his luxurious hunting estate, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring spread out maps before a pleased Führer. Göring, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, was a man consumed by vanity and boundless confidence in his creation, the Luftwaffe. He had promised Hitler that his eagle wings would darken the sky over the Soviet Union. The promise was simple and brutal. First, annihilate the Soviet Air Force on the ground in the first hours of the invasion, a task they accomplished with terrifying efficiency. Second, act as flying artillery for the army, clearing the way for the panzer divisions in their unstoppable advance eastward. And third, the final blow, pulverize the enemy's cities, starting with Moscow. The plan to bomb the capital was the culmination of their doctrine. They believed the Soviet Union was a primitive colossus, a state centralized to the extreme. If the head, Moscow, was cut off, the entire body would collapse. The city was not just a military target. It was the nerve center of the railway system, the heart of industry, and above all, the symbol of Stalin's power. The mindset of the Nazi high command was steeped in racial and technological arrogance. In their reports, they described the Soviet soldier as a subhuman, a Slav incapable of initiative, and his leadership as a gang of incompetent criminals. They completely underestimated the resilience of a people who had endured centuries of invasions and decades of internal tyranny. They believed that a few weeks of terror bombing, combined with the advance of their armies, would be enough to provoke panic and the collapse of the regime. Confidence was so absolute that plans for the winter were practically non-existent. The war would be over, they were sure. before the first snow fell. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's Luftwaffe 2 was given the task, and his pilots set off with the conviction that they were carrying out an execution, not fighting a battle. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Joseph Stalin faced the deepest crisis of his rule. The first days of the invasion had been an unmitigated catastrophe. Entire armies had been encircled and annihilated. The VVS, the Soviet Air Force, had been massacred on its airfields. Now, the enemy was not only at the gates but also overhead. The attack on Moscow was a personal affront. It was a direct challenge to his authority, a humiliation before the world. Many in his inner circle expected him to evacuate, to move the government to the safety of Kuibyshev to the east. But Stalin, paranoid and ruthless, understood the power of symbols. Fleeing Moscow would be a sign of weakness that could fracture the nation's morale. He made the decision that would define him as a war leader. He would stay. His philosophy of command was not based on tactical subtlety, but on brute force, industrial scale, and an absolute disregard for human cost. If the enemy came with fire, he would answer with an inferno. The defense of Moscow would not be just a battle. It would be the first act of a total war. While Goering's bombers streaked across the sky, Stalin was not only organizing the anti-aircraft defense, he was setting in motion a plan of unimaginable audacity, a plan that involved dismantling more than 1,500 factories in Western Russia and moving them, piece by piece, on thousands of trains, beyond the Ural Mountains, far from the reach of the Luftwaffe. He was not just thinking about surviving the winter of 1941. He was thinking about 1943, 1944, and 1945. He was thinking of a war production that would crush Germany's efficient but limited industry under a mountain of steel. And at the heart of that industrial vision was one particular weapon, an aircraft designed not for elegance, but for brutality. An aircraft that would become the instrument of his revenge, the Ilyushin Il-2, the flying tank. The air offensive against Moscow, which began with such confidence, soon met an unexpected reality. The capital's defenses were far more formidable than German intelligence had anticipated. Every night, the bombers of Luftwaffe 2 faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Hundreds of 85mm guns, coordinated by radar, filled the sky with clouds of lethal shrapnel. A dense ring of searchlights created cones of light where MiG-3 and Yak-1 night fighters waited to pounce on trapped bombers. On the ground, Soviet ingenuity was on full display. The Kremlin and other iconic buildings were camouflaged with nets and paint, transforming their recognizable silhouettes into nondescript housing blocks from the air. Barrage balloons floated over the city, their steel cables ready to tear the wing off any plane that dared to fly low. The Luftwaffe began to suffer unsustainable losses. Each raid cost valuable aircraft and experienced crews that could not be easily replaced. As autumn progressed, the weather became Moscow's greatest ally. Low clouds, freezing rain, and the first severe blizzards of the legendary Russian winter drastically limited air operations. The bombings, which had been a daily torrent, were reduced to a sporadic trickle. In December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive, launched with fresh Siberian troops acclimated to the cold, pushed back a frozen and exhausted army group center. The bombing of Moscow had failed. The city had not been broken. The regime had not collapsed. The lightning war had died in the snow at the gates of the capital. This failure was the true turning point. For Stalin, surviving the crisis was a validation of his strategy of all-out resistance. With the enemy pushed back from his throat, the focus shifted from survival to building the war machine that would carry out his retribution. The industrial relocation to the Urals, the largest in history, began to bear fruit. In new industrial cities that sprang up from nothing in Siberia, the evacuated factories worked 24 hours a day. Stalin's order was clear. Production must focus on simple, robust, and above all, massive designs. Intricate German perfectionism would be drowned by sheer Soviet quantity. The T-34 tank and the Ilyushin Il-2 attack aircraft were the ultimate exponents of this philosophy. The Il-2, in particular, was an obsession for Stalin. When initial production lagged, he sent an infamous telegram to the factory directors. The Il-2 aircraft are as necessary for the Red Army as the air it breathes, as the bread it eats. I ask you not to test the government's patience. I demand you produce more Il-2s. The threat was not veiled, and it worked. Production skyrocketed. On November 7, 1941, at the darkest moment, with German vanguards barely 30 kilometers away, Stalin made his most audacious act of defiance. Instead of canceling the traditional October Revolution parade, he held it in Red Square. As snow fell on the battalions of soldiers who would march directly from the parade to the front, Stalin delivered a speech that resonated throughout the Soviet Union. He invoked the great heroes of Tsarist Russia, merging Russian patriotism with Soviet ideology, and concluded with a grim promise: the enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours. That day, on that snowy square, the seed of vengeance was planted. It was not just a promise of victory, it was an oath of retribution. The nation that had been on its knees, its capital in flames, had made a decision. It would survive, rebuild its strength, and then unleash it upon its enemies with a multiplied fury. The story of how this decision transformed a nearly annihilated air force into the juggernaut that would finally darken the skies over Berlin is one of the most epic sagas of the Second World War. To witness the construction of this formidable machine of vengeance and the climax of its fury, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. Leave a like if you are ready to see how the vengeance forged in the cold of Moscow became the inferno that consumed Berlin. The revenge was not a single act, but a crescendo of violence that grew over 3.5 years across the entire Eastern Front. But its final symphony, the most thunderous and terrible, was reserved for April 1945, for the Battle of Berlin. What the Luftwaffe had attempted to do to Moscow with a few hundred bombers, the Soviet Air Force would do with thousands of aircraft, not as an act of terror, but as a systematic demolition. The offensive began in the early hours of April 16th, but the first assault did not come from the air. It came from the ground. Along the Oder River, Marshal Zhukov unleashed the largest artillery bombardment in human history. Thousands of cannons and Katyusha multiple rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously. The night turned into day. An artificial dawn created by a torrent of steel and fire that literally swept away the first lines of German defense. It was Stalin's artillery concert. At dawn, the Air Force joined the orchestra. On that first day alone, the 16th Air Army flew more than 5,000 sorties. These were not the high-altitude strategic bombers of the Western Allies. They were swarms of fighters, light bombers, and above all, the star of the show, the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik. Production of the Il-2 had exceeded 36,000 units, making it the most produced military aircraft in history. And now, thousands of them were converging on the skies over Berlin. These were not planes designed to bomb cities from the safety of 10,000 meters. They were flying tanks, armored beasts designed to fight at low altitude, in the mud and smoke of the battlefield. The Sturmovik pilots were a breed apart. Many had been infantrymen or tankers in 1941 and 1942. They had suffered under the scourge of the German Stukas. They remembered running for cover, watching their comrades torn apart from the air. For them, attacking Berlin was not just an order, it was a personal, visceral, and long-awaited revenge. Their tactic was that of the aerial steamroller. They flew in waves, often so low they almost scraped the rooftops of the ruined city. Their job was to coordinate directly with the tanks and infantry advancing street by street. A German machine gun nest is entrenched in an apartment building. The commander of the T-34 tank radios it in. Minutes later, a squadron of Il-2s descends. The sound of their 23mm cannons was like a circular saw tearing through metal. Their 82mm rockets slammed into facades, blowing open huge holes. Their bombs fell with brutal precision. The building ceased to be a defensive position and became a pile of bricks and dust. Then, the T-34 moved forward, day after day. For 2 weeks, this pattern was repeated thousands of times. The VVS flew more than 90,000 sorties over the city. Berlin was not bombed. It was dismantled from the air, block by block, house by house. The pilots flew so low they could see the faces of the defenders. The terror in the eyes of the old men of the Volkssturm and the teenagers of the Hitler Youth trying futilely to stop the tide. One Sturmovik pilot later recalled, "In 1941 they hunted us on our fields. Now we hunted them in their lair. There was no escape. If they moved, we saw them. If they shot, we saw them. And if we saw them, they died." In the air, the few remaining German jet fighters, the Messerschmitt 262s, were like ghosts, too fast to be intercepted, but too few to make any difference. Soviet air superiority was not just superiority. It was total and absolute omnipresence. The sky over Berlin belonged to the Red Army. The vengeance Stalin had sworn in the darkness of 1941 was being carried out in broad daylight, in a whirlwind of fire, smoke, and steel. For the wretched defenders of Berlin, sound became the primary instrument of psychological torture. It was a constant, menacing drone on the horizon, the sound of hundreds of the Sturmovix, Klimov engines, a sound that never ceased, that meant death was always lurking, ready to descend from the gray, smoke-filled sky. The Soviet air presence was so overwhelming that it shattered any semblance of organized resistance. How can you defend a barricade when a plane can simply fly down the street and destroy it along with all its defenders? How can you organize a counterattack when any concentration of troops is annihilated from the air in minutes? The psychological breaking point for the average German soldier was not a single battle, but the accumulation of this helplessness. They looked to the sky, desperately searching for the familiar silhouette of a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf, but the sky was empty of black crosses. The mighty Luftwaffe that had promised them eternal air supremacy had vanished, leaving the capital of the Reich at the mercy of its enemies. A 16-year-old from the Hitler Youth, huddled in a crater with his Panzerfaust, described the experience. He was waiting for a T-34 tank to appear around the corner. But before he could see the tank, he heard the roar. An IL-2 appeared over the buildings, its cannons spitting tracers. It wasn't aiming at him directly. It just sprayed the entire street. A shower of steel that forced him to bury his face in the dust, paralyzed with fear. By the time the plane was gone, the tank had already passed. This domino effect accelerated the city's collapse in a way that not even the massive artillery could achieve. The defense of Berlin became a series of isolated, suicidal actions. Every defended building, every strong point, was simply wiped off the map. The IL-2s acted as the eyes and the hammer of the ground armies. They suppressed the lethal 88mm anti-aircraft batteries entrenched in the Tiergarten flak towers. They hunted snipers in the upper floors of the Reichstag. They destroyed the bridges over the Spree before the defenders could blow them. They made the battlefield transparent for Soviet commanders and completely opaque and lethal for the Germans. The synergy between ground and air forces was total. Sturmovik pilots saw the Soviet tankers as their brothers in arms. They would drop colored smoke flares to mark their own positions and avoid friendly fire, a deadly, coordinated dance in the midst of urban chaos. For the civilians trapped in the cellars, the sound of the Sturmovix was the drumbeat announcing the arrival of the ground troops. It was the soundtrack to the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods their own regime had promised. Vengeance was not just the physical destruction of the city, it was the annihilation of hope, the eradication of any possibility of resistance. It was the total control of time, space, and violence. On May 2, 1945, the Berlin garrison surrendered unconditionally. 2 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker as the sound of Soviet artillery and the Sturmovix bombs rumbled above his head. The battle was over. Stalin's revenge was complete. The city was a vision of hell, a moonscape of skeletal buildings, streets turned into canyons of rubble, and an unnatural silence broken only by the wind blowing through the ruins. Above the Reichstag, shattered but still standing, flew the red flag with the hammer and sickle. The final statistics tell a story of asymmetrical retribution. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign on Moscow in 1941, though terrifying for its inhabitants, caused relatively limited damage. An estimated 2,000 people died. The city, though scarred, survived largely intact. In contrast, the Battle of Berlin was a cataclysm. More than 100,000 civilians lost their lives in the final weeks alone. The Soviet Air Force dropped nearly 40,000 tons of bombs on the city during the final offensive, a figure that doesn't even include the millions of artillery shells. The historic center of Berlin was wiped from the map. In the long run, the narrative of vengeance from Moscow to Berlin became the cornerstone of the Great Patriotic War's mythology. It was the ultimate proof of the Soviet people's resilience and the crushing power of their war machine, rebuilt from the ashes. It symbolized the journey from desperation to total victory. The Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik went down in history as a legend, an icon of Soviet victory. It was not a beautiful or technologically advanced aircraft like a Spitfire or a Mustang. It was crude, brutally functional, and produced in astonishing numbers. It was the perfect weapon for the war the Red Army was fighting. It was the flying tank, the instrument of Stalin's wrath, the steel hammer that helped carry the red flag from the outskirts of Moscow to the smoking heart of the Reich. The circle of the air war on the Eastern Front, which had begun with Göring's arrogance over an unsuspecting capital, closed with a methodical, annihilating fury over his own. The lesson, written in fire and steel in the skies of Europe, was terrible and clear. Those who unleash the storm must be prepared to reap the whirlwind.